What if we told you that to understand the war in Ukraine, you first need to understand the ghost of two devastating economic crises that struck both countries? When we talk about bankruptcy, the mind immediately goes to distant nations like Sri Lanka or Argentina. But in reality, many European nations in recent decades have come dangerously close to the edge. In this video, we will tell you the story of 5 countries in our continent that risked default. Together, we will look at the causes, the culprits, and why history so often repeats itself. And we will discover how these crises from the past are the key to interpreting our present. If you want a second episode with 5 more nations in the heart of Europe, write Europe in the comments. Welcome to Amazing Europe. Number 1. United Kingdom and Italy. We begin with 2 nations together because their crisis was caused by the same man. In 1992, Italy and the United Kingdom were trapped in a golden cage, the European monetary system. Forced to tie their weak currencies to the mighty German mark, they found themselves in an unsustainable situation. When reunified Germany raised interest rates, the mark became a rock, and for them keeping up was like a tired athlete trying to beat a world champion. Their currencies were artificially overvalued at the time, a weakness one man did not miss: George Soros. He understood a brutal truth. The central banks of Italy and the United Kingdom did not have enough money to defend this fiction indefinitely. His move was ruthless. He bet billions on their collapse by short-selling their currencies. It was like shouting to the world that the athlete was about to faint, inviting everyone to bet on his fall. Other speculators followed en masse, creating financial pressure that soon became unbearable and setting the stage for Judgment Day. September 16, 1992, was Black Wednesday. Despite a desperate defense, the central banks of Italy and the United Kingdom were overwhelmed. Expelled in humiliation from the European monetary system, their currencies collapsed, while Soros earned $1 billion in a single day. But although the attack on the 2 nations was identical, their vulnerabilities were profoundly different. The only problem for the United Kingdom was an artificially expensive currency that was suffocating its companies. Once freed from the constraints of the European monetary system, the pound lost value, and this turned out to be a cure. British products became affordable, exports boomed, and the crisis ended quickly. It was a political humiliation, but a true economic liberation, not a mortal risk. Italy's problem, on the other hand, was not just the currency, but its gigantic public debt. The fear was real: state bankruptcy and the inability to pay salaries and pensions. The cure was brutal surgery, a financial measure of 93 trillion lire, which, taking inflation into account, would be the equivalent of today's 100 billion euros. But the most traumatic move was the overnight forced withdrawal of 6 per 1,000 from the bank accounts of all Italians, a desperate act to save the state. The devaluation of the lira also helped, acting as a safety valve that boosted exports. Today, with the euro, that valve no longer exists, making modern crises even harder to resolve. Soros exposed truths that everyone ignored, and he took advantage of them. Years later, the Hungarian-born American magnate declared he had no regrets about that move. These were his words: "The speculative attack against the lira was a legitimate financial operation. Speculators do their job. They bear no guilt. The responsibility lies with lawmakers who allow speculation to take place. Speculators are only the messengers of bad news." But Soros, much more than in Italy and the United Kingdom, is seen as public enemy number 1 in another nation, and now we will discover why. Number 2. Hungary. After decades behind the Iron Curtain, Hungary in the 2000s was running. It wanted everything, and it wanted it immediately: new houses, German cars, the good life of the West. But to run that fast, fuel was needed, and Hungary found a gas station that seemed to offer fuel almost for free. It did not know that this fuel was a ticking time bomb. Hungary's problem was simple: its currency, the forint, was weak, and interest rates on loans were extremely high. Taking out a mortgage in forints was a drain, but banks, especially Austrian ones, offered a solution that seemed magical: borrowing in foreign currency, mainly in Swiss francs. Why? Because the Swiss franc was a very strong currency, and interest rates in Switzerland were ridiculously low. For hundreds of thousands of Hungarian families, it was a dream. The mortgage payment in Swiss francs was half the cost of one in forints. Everyone jumped in. Citizens to buy houses, municipalities to build infrastructure. The entire nation got into debt in a currency that was not its own. It was a colossal bet. Everyone was betting that the value of the forint against the Swiss franc would remain stable. But in betting, the house always wins. September 2008. The Lehman Brothers iceberg struck. Panic spread across the world. Global investors fled from risky markets such as Eastern Europe, and Hungary was on the front line. The inevitable happened. The value of the Hungarian forint collapsed into the abyss, and the franc, the ultimate safe haven, shot through the roof. The trap had sprung. Imagine that your mortgage payment is calculated in a foreign currency. If your currency collapses and the foreign one strengthens, your payment does not just increase a little, it explodes. The payments of Hungarians doubled, tripled. Millions of people found themselves on the brink of ruin. In October 2008, Hungary was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was the first country of the European Union to request an emergency bailout. The cavalry arrived, the famous Troika, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, and the European Central Bank. But it was not a friendly rescue. It was a national humiliation. The Troika granted a loan of $25 billion, but in return demanded a brutal horse cure: austerity, cuts in public spending, tax increases. For Hungarians, it was a trauma. Not only had they been deceived by the promise of easy wealth, but now they were being placed under guardianship by foreign powers dictating the rules in Budapest. They felt betrayed twice. Hungary survived, but that trauma changed its soul forever. It generated a deep sentiment, almost an obsession. Never again under a master. The visceral hatred of foreign debt and foreign interference paved the way for the rise of Viktor Orbán. His rhetoric against Brussels and his war against George Soros all originate from there. From the vow never again to allow anyone to dictate the rules in his own house. Even though we have seen that the origin of this crisis was not external interference, but rather internal economic weakness, combined with a decidedly reckless bet. And the ultimate causes of another European nation's crisis were also internal, although this time it was a much richer country. Number 3. Iceland. For centuries, Iceland was a quiet island of fishermen. At the dawn of the new millennium, however, the descendants of the Vikings launched a new raid: global finance. It all began when the government privatized its banks, handing them over to a new generation of ruthless bankers. Their plan was simple: become giants. But Iceland was far too small to feed their ambitions. The solution? Feeding on foreign money. They began borrowing billions from international banks and convincing Dutch and British citizens to deposit their savings into Icelandic banks, which offered online accounts with very high interest rates. Icelandic banks became financial vacuum cleaners, using easy money to buy companies and football teams across Europe. They were building an empire on a mountain of debt, preparing the ground for a spectacular collapse. Their value grew to 10 times the real economy of Iceland. But in September 2008, the Lehman Brothers iceberg struck global finance. The party of easy money ended abruptly. For Icelandic banks, which lived on foreign loans, it was the beginning of the end. Creditors wanted their billions back, but the coffers were empty. In a single apocalyptic week of October, the 3 giant banks collapsed. The currency turned into worthless paper. Savings vanished. The country was on the verge of bankruptcy, pushing a people hungry for justice into the streets, banging pots and pans, and giving birth to the pots and pans revolution. But how did this island rise again from its ashes? The government faced a brutal choice: save its banks by drowning the people in foreign debt, or save the people and let the banks fail. Their decision was unthinkable. Unlike the United States or Ireland, taxpayers' money was not used to rescue the banks, which went bankrupt. What followed was a lesson in survival and defiance. First, an emergency loan from the IMF to stay afloat. Then, the roar of the people. In 2 referendums, they voted no to paying the private banking debts owed to the Dutch and the British. And finally, accountability. Unlike anywhere else in the world, The bankers responsible for the disaster ended up in prison. The lesson seemed learned. Never again allow finance to hold the nation hostage. The banks were nationalized, and new strict rules were written to prevent money from fleeing the country. But once calm returned, a controversial process of re-privatization began. Of course, today's banks are smaller, and the rules are stricter than before. Yet one disturbing question remains. Has Iceland truly learned, or is it slowly preparing the ground for the next disaster? Number 4. Russia. Before talking about the Russian crisis, an essential premise. We at Amazing Europe are always and unconditionally in favor of peace. In this video, we have no intention of speaking badly about one nation or another, as you will see later on. Our purpose is not even to explain all the causes of the war, which are many and very complex. What we want is to show you some economic backgrounds behind the nations involved in order to better understand the present. In the mid-1990s, after 70 years of communism, Russia was embracing capitalism. It seemed invincible, but in reality, it was a giant made of clay, and a heavy storm was about to fall. It was a fragile giant above all for 3 reasons. The first was the excessive dependence of its economy on oil and gas. The second reason was that the wealth of the former Soviet Union had not gone to the people, but to a small group of ruthless men who did not even pay taxes, leaving the state permanently without money. The third reason was a true state fraud. To pay salaries and pensions, Boris Yeltsin's government invented a legalized scam. It began selling government bonds called GKOs, promising insane interest rates up to 150%. How could they pay them? Simple. They used the money of new investors to pay the old ones, a game destined to end in disaster. In 1997 and 1998, 2 lightning bolts struck the clay giant. The first was the Asian financial crisis, which frightened investors worldwide. They began withdrawing their money from risky markets, among them GKOs, which stopped being financed. The second lightning bolt was the collapse of oil prices. The only real source of state revenue dried up overnight. The Yeltsin government asked for help from the International Monetary Fund, which granted a loan of over $20 billion. But the money was burned in just a few weeks. On August 17, 1998, Russia made an announcement that froze the world, declaring to GKO investors, "We have no money to repay you. Those pieces of paper are now worth 0. It was bankruptcy. A nuclear superpower had just gone broke. The lifelong savings of millions of Russians vanished in a single night. Stores emptied, inflation exploded, people returned to bartering. The dream of capitalism became a nightmare. Russia recovered quickly, thanks to the fact that oil prices started to rise again, and also because the devaluation of the ruble made Russian products extremely competitive. But the crisis left a deep scar on the nation's soul. The humiliation of 1998 created a national obsession. Never again be weak, never again depend on others. Today, almost 30 years later, the Russian economy is still dependent on oil and gas. But the humiliation of 1998 brought a new man to power, Vladimir Putin. His economic mission is clear, and it comes directly from that trauma, making Russia financially invulnerable at any cost, even at the expense of the lives of others. That trauma shaped today's strategy. To understand Russia in the 21st century, one must understand the ghost of 1998. And to understand the crisis in Ukraine, one must also look at the great economic crisis that this country faced. But before discovering the last country and finally seeing the common thread that connected all these crises, if you found this video informative, we ask you to support our project with a like by subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell so you don't miss our new videos. And we also remind you of our new channel, America vs. Europe, where we compare all European countries, the United States and Canada across different factors. Number 5. Ukraine. There are nations that are a bridge, others that are a border. Ukraine is both. For centuries, its identity has been a geological fault line, with one plate pushing toward Europe and another toward Russia. In 2014, that fault cracked, unleashing a political earthquake that nearly wiped out its economy. To understand the crisis, we should not look at the balance sheets, but at geography. Post-Soviet Ukraine was a fragile giant, kept alive by a very delicate balancing act. Its economy was dominated by the oligarchs. A small group of immensely wealthy men controlled industry and politics, with rampant corruption draining the state's coffers. In addition, it was excessively dependent on Russian gas, which was at the same time a powerful economic weapon in Moscow's hands. For years, Ukrainian leaders walked a tightrope between East and West. The director of this balancing act was the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. His strategy was to promise Europe a shared future, while never cutting the umbilical cord with Russia. But at the end of 2013, the balance collapsed. The European Union put the president before a choice, asking him to sign an association agreement with it to choose Europe. Yanukovych, at the last second, refused, choosing instead a loan from Moscow. That no was the spark that set the prairie on fire. Hundreds of thousands of pro-European Ukrainians filled Kiev's main square, the Maidan. The Revolution of Dignity was born. After months of violent protests, in February 2014, Yanukovych fled to Russia. The revolution had won. But when the new leaders entered the offices of power, they made a chilling discovery. The state was an empty shell. The treasury coffers had been drained. The country was on its knees and penniless. The fall of Yanukovych triggered a geopolitical aftershock. Russia reacted by annexing Crimea. Shortly after, war broke out in Donbass, the industrial and mining heart of Ukraine. To be clear, things are much more complex than this, but our purpose is not to reveal every detail of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is to show that, among the many causes, there were also these severe economic crises that both countries faced. For the Ukrainian economy, it was the final blow. It lost a vital part of its territory and industry. It was trapped in a war with devastating economic costs. Its currency collapsed, and its foreign exchange reserves evaporated. No one in the world wanted to lend money to a country at war and without an economy. In the summer of 2014, Ukraine was on the brink of total default. It no longer had the money to pay its debts or to finance the war. With its back against the wall, the new Ukraine did the only thing it could. It made a final choice. It turned to the West. The rescue came in the form of a massive aid package from the International Monetary Fund, the United States, and the European Union. But in return, they demanded extremely tough reforms, higher gas prices for the population, spending cuts, and above all, a real fight against corruption, a point on which the European Union was very clear. But after examining the economic crises of several European nations, we ask you, did you notice something? Did you notice that, although so different, these stories reveal common patterns? First, there is always the lure of easy wealth. The Swiss franc mortgages in Hungary, the reckless lending of Icelandic banks, the insane yields of Russian government bonds. It is the promise of a shortcut, an illusion that always ends up presenting a very heavy bill. Second, the seed of disaster is almost always internal. External agents, like Soros or Lehman Brothers, strike only where they find a prey already wounded. Italy's public debt, Russia's dependence on oil and the corruption of its oligarchs, rampant corruption in Ukraine, out-of-control finance in Iceland. Of course, we are by no means justifying those who attack these nations, far from it. But we are acknowledging that the external attack is only the spark, while the gunpowder has always been stockpiled at home for years. Third, geopolitics is the playing field. None of these crises is purely economic. The Italian and British ones were born from the rules of a political project, the European monetary system. The Hungarian one forged an entire nationalist doctrine. The Russian and Ukrainian ones, as we have seen, are the origin, at least in part, of a tremendous conflict. But perhaps the most frightening lesson is another. Memory is short. Iceland, which imprisoned its bankers, is already reprivatizing its banks. Russia, traumatized by default, is still dependent on its raw materials. And the West looked at these crises and thought itself immune, only to find itself in the middle of an even greater fire. In fact, there have been other European nations that have truly, without any exaggeration on our part, come close to bankruptcy in recent years. If you want us to tell their story, write Europe in the comments. And you cannot fully understand this video without also watching this one, where you will discover 10 European cities that never really recovered from the 2008 economic crisis. That is all for this video. See you next time.